Hello, and thank you for stopping by for another episode of the MFA Writers Podcast. This episode is being released on April 13th, 2 days before the vast majority of MFA programs require a decision on any offer of attendance. So for anyone listening, trying to make that last-minute decision, good luck and follow your gut. And for anyone who is anxiously awaiting word on whether they've been accepted off the wait list, Godspeed and good luck to you as well. For those of you who applied this year and didn't get the acceptance you were hoping for, I'm really excited for you to hear today's episode with the fantastic writer Alejandro Puyana. When you read Alejandro's work, you'd think there was no way he has ever been rejected from anything. However, Alejandro went through the application process several years in a row before finally getting an acceptance. Now, you can read his work in the Best American Short Stories anthology for 2020. So for those of you who need to hear this, hang in there and keep writing. You can find MFA Writers on Instagram and Twitter as well as mfawriters.com. Feel free to shoot us a direct message on one of those platforms or send us an email at mfawriterspodcast@gmail.com. We love to hear from listeners. And if you have a minute to rate or review the show, we'd prefer you do that on Apple Podcasts. Doing so will help boost our podcast as we try to boost these amazing writers. Finally, as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome to MFA Writers, the podcast where we talk to creative writing MFA students about their program, their process, and a piece they're working on. I'm your host, Jared McCormick. Today I'm with Alejandro Puyana, a second-year fellow at the University of Texas at Austin's Michener Center for Writers. Alejandro has published nonfiction pieces in The Toast, Tin House Online, NPR, and The Huffington Post, and fiction at Huizache, The Examined Life, and Idaho Review. His short story, Hands of Dirty Children, was chosen by ZZ Packer as the winning story of American Short Fiction's Halifax Ranch Prize, and later chosen by Curtis Sittenfeld to be included in the 2020 Best American Short Stories collection. Today, Alejandro has brought an excerpt from a new story he's working on titled Strings.
Strings. 3 p.m. in Spanish Harlem, and Florentino Romero is running down the stairs of his building. He has to avoid the center lip of the steps, where erosion has made them slick and murderous. He wears brown bell-bottoms that hug his skinny legs and his not-really-there ass, flashy platform shoes, silver, and a white cotton shirt with a white collar, the first 3 buttons loose. His curly chest hair is tangled with a golden crucifix, a silver medallion with the image of La Virgen de Coromoto, and a small ebony fist, all hanging from the same thin chain. Florentino Romero carries a leather case. It's scratched, banged, a big dent on one corner, but it still protects the trumpet inside, a golden child in a red velvet uterus. He slams through the door of the building and into the Nueva York summer, humid, raucous, and funky. Florentino jumps over a stream of trash juice flowing from the mountain of bags on the corner of Lex and 107 and barely misses the wrong side of a yellow cab trying to catch the light. Permiso, permiso, he says as he bumps shoulders with 2 Dominican women gossiping about the Esmeralda telenovela. Sorry, man, voy tarde, he says as he nearly runs over the man in the green apron organizing the bananas in the fruit stand. Paga lo que debes, papi. He hears the yell from Fulgencio, aimed like a heat-seeking missile at him from the newsstands across the street. You don't mess with Fulgencio on his 5'0" frame. This is Fulgencio's nightly ritual, only known fully by his 2 ex-wives. A round of rope, a round of speed bag, a round of heavy bag, a round of shadow boxing. Repeat that 5 times, 100 sit-ups, the crack of an egg shell on a glass, and the pouring of whole milk over golden yolk, and the swallowing of leche con huevo. 1 cold shower, his naked body in bed if it's summer, 1 medal pulled from a drawer. The medal, bronze, for participation. On one side, 5 athletes representing the different continents all pull a rope. A year, 1936, a place, Berlin. On the reverse side of the Olympic bell, the German eagle in relief as well as the Olympic rings. It tastes like blood when Fulgencio kisses it goodnight. I've got you, Fulgi! Where do you think I'm going now? Florentino yells back and raises his trumpet up as if that is any guarantee for Fulgencio. Fulgencio dismisses him with a wave of his rough hand and remembers that lending money to musicians is its own form of charity. Down Lex still, Florentino sees the shape of the 98 bus. On a weekday, he would catch it. His strides are long, his lungs, a trumpet player's organs. The last time he ever remembers being out of breath was in primary school in Venezuela, playing sandlot baseball with Tulio and Gonzalo and El Flaco and the other kids of Fe y Alegría. At first, the Jesuit priests had no idea what to do with a ball that you didn't kick. But by the 7th grade, the sandlot was equally populated by pimpled teenagers and balding Spaniards in black robes. But today, on a Sunday, the bus isn't trapped by traffic. It pulls out of the bus stop and Florentino is still half a block away. The sputter from the bus's exhaust feels like a cackle. Florentino looks at his watch and makes the calculation. He actually considers walking an hour and a half, an hour if he rushes, but Chateau Madrid is not the type of gig you get too sweaty or late. The Black Cat, the Corso, even Ipanema, he'd be good. But a Chateau Madrid matinee is the type of gig where people notice, where a 60-something man in an impeccable blue suit could whisper to the maitre d', "That spick with a trumpet seems a bit disheveled, don't you think? Maybe we should have a talk with the band leader about it, for next time." Then there's no more Chateau Madrid gig for Florentino, an easy job that actually pays, where the tips flow at whiskey sour rate. The first two are free at the Chateau on Sundays. He's on 103 now and walking down the steps of the subway, 6th line. He hates it. He hates the smell, bouquet of urine and dust. He hates the way his skin turns chicken-like and clammy as soon as the cold draft hits him halfway down the steps. He hates looking up at the ceiling and feeling like the whole world could cave in at any moment and crush him. The Chateau gig, though. He owes Fulgencio. He owes his landlord. He owes Graciela, the Puerto Rican waitress he flirts with over at Sal's. "I'll get you next time, mi vida, te lo prometo." She didn't seem convinced. He hasn't sent money to Venezuela in 2 weeks. His mom doesn't mention it in her letter. She's a saint. But the shame strikes from between her cursive penmanship like a jaguar from tall grass.
Alejandro, thank you so much for sharing that with us, and thanks for being here.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited that you chose to read something that's like in progress. I'm really curious to talk about your process writing it, like where you are in that process, how you revise all those things. And like, as I was reading this excerpt, one thing that really stuck out to me was just some of these like really wonderful lines and descriptions that are already in this piece. A couple that I love are the apartment steps where erosion has made them slick and murderous. And that last line, how his mother's shame strikes from between her cursive penmanship like a jaguar from tall grass. I think that's beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
And this excerpt is very atmospheric. The sights and the sounds and the smells of this neighborhood are front and center. So for you, what most often propels a first draft? Is it a character or a setting that gets you going, or is it usually like a plot point that you're working towards?
Yeah, for me, very usually it's actually a subject matter that I'm interested about. I think character actually comes a little bit later. In this case, I really wanted to tell a story about this huge Latin American concert that happened in Zaire in 1974, where a bunch of musicians were flown over for the Muhammad Ali Foreman fight. And I've been in love with that story. I've seen documentaries about it, and I really love salsa music, and I wanted to write about that moment in time in New York City when salsa was really sort of starting to explode. So I knew I wanted to write about that. And then, you know, having that subject in mind, I've sort of known that I was going to write about this for like at least a couple of years, 2 or 3 years. And once the subject is there and I've kind of gotten to it where I want to actually sit down and write it, then I start to think about plot. And, you know, I pick a character but I don't really know much about that character yet. And that character kind of reveals itself as I'm writing the first draft. And I usually take a little bit of time on that first draft. I'm not a fast writer, and I kind of edit a little bit as I go, just while I'm figuring out even what the story is. In this case, it took me a while, and I'm sure we're going to talk about some of the obstacles of this story, but that's one of them. Is just figuring out what the story actually is. Like here, I knew that I wanted to start in New York City. I knew that I wanted a Venezuelan musician that is sort of in this salsa life when this phenomenon is happening in the city. So that's how it started. And, it was just, he needs to get to a gig and he's in New York City. And that was the jumping off point.
And go from there, right? Yeah, I mean, you said that you kind of edited as you were going. I was going to ask you about this because some writers will say that they just turn off that editing part of their brain completely for the first draft and just let it all flow and then go back and edit. And then other writers, like yourself, it sounds like, are kind of editing along the way. So what are you looking for as you're writing that first draft that makes you go back and make little edits? Like, is there something you're trying to achieve or other things, maybe conversely, that you're trying to avoid as you're writing that first draft?
Yeah. I mean, there are certain things that I know I want on a first draft. Like, I think most important to me is sort of action and movement. Like, I want to make sure that whatever character I have has an objective right off the bat that they're trying to accomplish. And I don't think that objective, and certainly in this case it isn't, that objective doesn't have to be the heart of the story, doesn't have to be the big question that the story is trying to answer. It just has to be something that gives the character something to accomplish so the reader can be pulled along by one string of tension. In this case, it's him getting to the venue, right? To the show that he's trying to get to in time to. And so once I pick that, I know that for me as a writer, that's going to let me write. That's going to give me something to write towards. So in this case, I started with that. And then things started to populate in the environment. Some idiosyncrasies of the character started to pop up. Like, I could tell that he was sort of obviously having some economic issues. He needs the money. I figured out that he has somebody back home that he's sending money to. I also kind of figured out that he's a guy that actually works pretty hard, that he's not like just this guy that lazies around, but all that sort of stuff started to populate his character. But then I run into the issue, because it's a first draft and I'm kind of like making it up as I go along, that I need to go back and sort of fine tune some stuff before I can feel confident enough to move forward. And I wish I was the writer that didn't do this. I wish that I could just move on and just kind of keep a mental note of things that I need to fix later. But it is important to me to sort of, at the sentence level, have things that sort of look nice or have a certain sound that is pleasing to me or a certain rhythm. And it's very hard for me to move past that if I still feel like it's clunky or so. Yeah, it's not a slow process for me to get the first draft out, but it works for me.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I hear a lot when I talk to people who have worked at lit mags or who have worked in publishing is for short stories, the first page has to be great and it really has to grab the reader's attention, because there's just so many people sending in stories. And if you want your story noticed, it's got to grab that reader's attention, because they might be reading 50, 60 stories at one time, right?
Yeah,
so
totally.
Is that something that you're thinking about when you work on a short story? And if so, are you going back and like fine tuning that first page? Is that like a thing that you want fine tuned before you move on? Like really have that hook?
I think I don't. And like, I definitely do that on my second draft, like first page revision. First draft, I just want to make sure that there's something that's pulling the reader along. In this case, it's him getting to Chateau Madrid. That's enough for me at this stage. And then that it sounds nice and that it has a rhythm. But certainly, once I get to my second draft, I think that first page, those first 5-6 paragraphs, are a point of focus for sure. I was actually thinking about that a little bit earlier. There's this amazing short story collection, Friday Black, and I always murder his name, Nana Kwame.
Ajay Brenya.
Ajay Brenya. I love that collection, and the title story in that collection has an amazing first page because it sets up the world really nicely. But what really captures me from that story is, I think it's in the maybe 4th or 5th paragraph, when he sets up that there's a competition to see how many coats each salesman sells. And we're talking about a post-apocalyptic world where zombies are shopping. Like, it's a very sort of weird setup. But that line of, oh, I'm going to sell the most coats because I want to get this prize for my mom, that's the sentence that for me is like, okay, this story has hooked me now, not because of all the zombies killing themselves to get in and buy stuff, but because there's something at stake for this guy that's selling coats, you know?
Yeah, for anyone who hasn't read that collection, number one, go read it tomorrow because it's fantastic. But that story in particular, Friday Black, is a play on Black Friday. So yeah, that's interesting. This is something I've been thinking about recently too, because I've been doing a practicum this semester at New Letters, which is published here at my university. It's a great literary magazine, and I've got to read through this slush pile and start thinking about some of these things that really catch a reader's attention. And so I have been thinking about that first page. But I think this is kind of what you were saying, that it's more important when I'm drafting a story for the first page to motivate me to keep writing. Something in there is exciting me to keep writing the draft. Yeah. And then once it's out, once it's finished, I can go back and revise the first page with the reader in mind. So first off, is that kind of the same for you? And then second, when you go back to revise and start thinking about revision, what are you looking for when you examine that first draft?
Yeah, no, that's exactly how I feel about it too. I mean, it's so important for the writer to be excited about the material, for it to really sort of move and sing when later on. I think what I'm looking for in revision after that first draft is definitely fine-tuning stuff. In this particular case, so where I am in the story right now is I finished the first draft like maybe 3 weeks ago. I've had a chance to workshop it in one of my workshops at the Michener, so I have a lot of stuff a lot of feedback that I've received. And now I haven't done anything with it. I'm just sitting on that and kind of just thinking about the piece, not even taking specific time to think about it, but just letting it marinate and sort of think about it. But I know that once I get back into it, the first thing I'm going to look is at at that first page, those first 2 pages, and sort of tighten up as much as I can. And then for this particular story, I think what I'm lacking a little bit in the first few chapters is sort of emotional stakes. I mean, there's a lot of movement. There's people coming and going, and he has to get something done. But there's certain emotional registers or thematic things that are still not coming through. Later on in this story, it's sort of divided into point of views. There's Florentino in the 1970s in New York City, and then his grandson later on in Venezuela, who's also a trumpet player. but for the national orchestra, for the youth orchestra in Venezuela, which is a very sort of lauded youth orchestra, the Simón Bolívar Symphonic. So there's the heart of the story is really the relationship between the grandfather and the grandson. And there's certain emotional registers that come across later on that I want to start sort of at least planting seeds in this first few pages for it to really pay off later. So now that I have the story and I know that that's the heart of it, for me, the challenge is in this revision, how can I start injecting some of those emotional stakes into the beginning of the story? When I was writing it, I didn't even know what the story was going to be about. So, of course, they just don't exist on the page yet. So it's folding in all the stuff that I discovered later on while I was writing the story, is folding that stuff into the beginning of it and making sure it makes sense as a complete piece.
Yeah, that totally makes sense to me. So it's like what I'm hearing is it's really about finding that balance when you're drafting a piece between like trying to hook the reader and get the piece moving, but also leaving space to figure things out as you go and let the character, like you said, the characters sometimes don't really develop until later in the story. And some of those themes, those characters, those are coming to you later in a draft usually?
Yeah, usually. I mean, it varies from story to story, of course. Like I think with Hands of Dirty Children, that character came much more clear to me early on. Like I feel like the first draft of that story, the character came much more fully formed than this one. And maybe it was, because of the emotional weight of it, because of the inherent drama of children living in the streets, and because it's told from a kid's point of view. Like the voice is all like, for me, the voice was already going to have to be kind of at the same time innocent and at the same time very practical, because the kid is surviving in the streets, but he's still a child. So there had to be those two components that kind of like danced with each other. So in that case, I think the voice and the character came a little bit earlier than on Strings, and then on most of the other stuff that I've written. Usually a character sort of like builds as I write, or I just, more than building the character, I think I discover the character as I write through the story, and then second draft is all about making it look like I had thought about that from the very beginning.
Exactly. I love that. So you go back, you're doing revision. How long does it usually take you to revise a piece before you're like, okay, this is done? And then second part of that question, how do you know it's done? And how do you, like for you, how do you know that it's ready to submit? Is there something that jumps out to you, something that tells you that?
Yeah, I think me knowing that it's done and me knowing that it's ready to submit is two different things. Like I often submit before I feel in my heart that the story is perfect. Because I think, at least for me, when I finish writing a story and I've worked on it for a little bit, I get impatient with it, and I know that it might need a little bit more. And I know that it could be more perfect, but I get impatient with it, and I just say, all right, this feels good to me. There's some rough edges that maybe even add sort of energy to the piece, that if I smooth them out more, if I try to tighten it more, I might even start losing some of the vibrancy of the story. So once I've revised it a few times, and I know that the core of the story is there and that the language is pretty, like I like the way the story sounds, even though there might be things to perfect, I think most of the time I just stop there. And I start sending it out. And if I get plenty of rejections, which is usually the case, usually there's some stuff that starts to kind of float up. And I'm like, okay, maybe this section needs some work.
So this story, Strings, takes place in New York City, as you mentioned, but that other story you mentioned, Hands of Dirty Children, which won the Halifax Ranch Prize at American Short Fiction and was later included in the 2020 Best American Short Stories collection, is based in your home country of Venezuela. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
How important has your experience in and connection to Venezuela been to your writing?
Yeah, I mean, it's the reason why I write, pretty much. I grew up in Venezuela, went to high school and college there, and I moved to Austin in 2006 for grad school. I was 26 then, and I came to do a master's degree in advertising. And the Venezuelan political situation already then was really tough, and now is just as tough, as not more. The country is sort of economically in crisis. There's a lot of issues that we're dealing with, both political, economical, societal. It's very complex. But when I left in 2006, my whole family was in Venezuela. There were plenty of moments of protest and great tension and great danger for my family. I think I felt really guilty that I was here and I was safe while, my brother was marching, every other day and getting in skirmishes with, the National Guard, and people were being shot and being taken prisoner, all this sort of stuff. And, I had written a little bit in college in Venezuela. I had sort of written some short stories, sort of imitating some of my favorite writers at the time. And I had shown it to a few people. I mean, I liked doing it, but I'd never considered it a path that I could take, later on in life. But with this, being in Austin, being obsessed with watching the news about what was happening back home, and being on the phone with my parents and my brother all the time about, what are you guys doing this weekend? Are you guys going to be safe? Where's the march? Where are you guys beginning? The only way that I found to process all of that was writing about it. And there was one particular moment. I was living in Austin, and my brother got held hostage by some guys. He was in a friend's house. They were waiting to go out to a soccer game, and these guys broke into the house to rob it. The police somehow found out, came and cordoned off the place, and they were held hostage in that house for, I don't know, a few hours, a couple of hours, something like that. And my mom called me that night after it had happened. So my brother was already safe. I didn't realize anything that was going on while it was going on. And then my mom called me and told me the story. And then I eventually talked to my brother about it. And it felt like so overwhelming. And I'd been through similar experiences in the past in Venice when I lived in Venezuela. Being kidnapped is certainly something that you hear about often, that people around you have experienced. This wasn't the first time that something like this happened very close to me. But being away, being in a different place, made a huge difference. Because it took away this illusion of control that we have. If we are in the same place with our family, we feel like We have some control over our emotions, over their emotions, being together, being able to, hug your brother after this horrible traumatic experience. I couldn't do any of that. And I wrote about it, and it helped me a lot to sort of be able to figure out in my head why Venezuela was the way it was, at least for me, right? And try to figure out what my brother might have been feeling and what I was feeling. And that eventually became an essay. And I at some point, I submitted that essay. That was the first piece that I ever published, was an essay on, at that time, it was called The Butter. It was Roxane Gay's sort of spin-off blog at The Toast. It was called Two Kidnappings, and that was the first piece that I ever got published. And since then, not since the publication, but since the writing of that essay, like, writing became a way for me to process everything that was happening in Venezuela and a way to calm myself down. And that's where I really fell in love with it at that point.
Well, before I move on, if you don't mind me asking, how's your family doing now?
Everyone's good. My parents moved. Since then they've all migrated to the U.S. My dad was the last person to do so right before the pandemic hit, and my dad and my mom still sort of share their time between Venezuela and the U.S., but they spend most of their time here. My brother moved here about 2 years ago, so everyone's safe and everyone's slowly been migrating.
So, you said you wrote first an essay about this that helped you process it. I'm curious, now that you write fiction, what is it about fiction that you think makes it uniquely suited for exploring these complex situations and emotions and traumas that we go through in our actual lives?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's that process of inhabiting other heads, other places. Certainly the freedom that fiction gives you to explore things. When I wrote Hands of Dirty Children, it was certainly an experience that I had never had, being on the streets. But it was something, I knew that the story of contemporary Venezuela, couldn't be even approached without noticing the great injustices and inequalities of that society, without recognizing the immense pain that the country has inflicted on its citizens of all kind of stripes, especially the most vulnerable. And I remember, like Strings, like the story that I'm working on now, I knew that I wanted to write about street children in Venezuela because when I would visit my family there, I was just so, I would go every year or every year and a half. And every time I went, something huge had changed in the country, And one of those times I just saw groups of kids, 5 to 10 kids strong, just surviving in the streets. And that's something that certainly existed when I was living there, but not to this extent. And it just shook me in a way that I couldn't quite escape. And I thought about it for a very long time, and I couldn't quite process it. And it wasn't until I wrote the piece that it I was able to at least approach it in some sort of way and kind of handle it.
Well, after finishing Hands of Dirty Children, you told me that was 3 years ago you finished that story, and then you mostly turned your attention to writing your first novel. So what motivated that change?
Well, I think I wanted to tackle my questions about Venezuela in a larger sort of way. The novel also stemmed from my brother's kidnapping, and I knew that I wanted to write about that sort of from a fiction lens, and I wanted to explore sort of the history of Venezuela in a more in-depth way, in a way that a short story wasn't really adequate. So yeah, I embarked on that project, which at first started very innocently, I guess. I thought that it was going to be just like I would write for a few months. I would, get to 80,000 words, and it would be done. But of course, that hasn't been the case, and it's been sort of ballooning. And I started working on it for a workshop that I found in Austin a few years ago, and worked on it there. And then eventually, when I got into the program, then really, really sort of focused on that. And I also just wrapped up the first draft of that project about a month ago, or a month and a half ago. So I'm very excited to jump into the revisions for that, which will take obviously a lot longer.
Well, I was going to ask, I mean, we've talked a little bit about revising, but mostly in the context of short stories. So what do you anticipate being different about revising this long form piece of work?
Yeah, I mean, it's all speculation because I've never written a novel before this one. So it's all new territory for me. I know it's going to take a lot of work. I mean, thankfully, and I'm sure we're going to get this when we start talking about the Michener, but the program has been so amazing in helping me sort of mold the novel. I think structurally, it's been the biggest help, because they really, through different workshops and different people reading it, I've really found a structure that I think works really well. And that's what I was the most afraid of when I tackled the novel, because it became like a three-part novel, and it's kind of complex and sprawling in both time and location. So I was really kind of petrified about what that would mean. But the program really helped me think about it and find a structure that right now feels like it's working really well. So that piece of the puzzle, at least for now, seems like it's working, and that's a big one. Now, for me, it's all about length. I mean, it's a long novel. I know that I need to tighten. I know that I need to cut. And that's where all of my efforts are going to be sort of focused on in the next few months. And I have no idea how difficult or easy it's going to be. I'm sure it's going to be more difficult than easy. But I'll get started when this semester ends. I have plenty of other stuff to do until then, so I'm not even gonna worry about it for now.
Well, it might not be easy, but I hope it's fun. It sounds like a really interesting project. And is that going to be the thesis for your MFA program? Is that what you're anticipating?
Yeah, for sure. It's going to take, I'm on the end of my second year, so I have one more year left in the program. And, it's going to be all working on that until I finish.
It sounds exciting. I can't wait to read it. But yeah, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the Michener Center for Writers. This is one of two programs actually at the University of Texas at Austin. But what sets the Michener Center apart is that it's a 3-year fully funded residency program that does not require any teaching. The idea being that students can fully focus on their writing while they're in the program. It's a pretty prestigious program. It's generally considered one of the best in the country. Only 12 writers are admitted each year. According to the website, the acceptance rate is less than 0.5% in fiction and between 2 and 3% for the other genres. Someone hearing that might get discouraged at these facts and figures and maybe not apply at all. But you did the opposite, applying 4 times before getting accepted. So please tell us about your decision to apply in the first place and what made you continue to apply after being rejected the first 3 times.
Yeah. First of all, I'll say that there are plenty of people that get accepted into the Michener after their first try. Like 2 or 3 times is not uncommon at all. A lot of people, it happens like that for some of us. For me, like, I had to stay in Austin. I had started a business in 2014. I couldn't really move. And I knew that I wanted to pursue the writing thing. So I applied to all of the programs that were around here. I applied to New Writers Project, which is the other program at the University of Texas. I applied to the Michener, and then I also applied to Texas State, which is just an hour away in San Marcos, Texas. And I knew I needed to stay here. So that's the reason why it felt okay to just keep applying, because I knew that I couldn't sort of broaden my search for a program. I knew that it was an amazing program. I knew that it was worth it to keep applying. And I also knew that I was getting better at the craft of writing. I mean, I found a workshop outside of university that really helped me sort of fine tune my stories. I had a group of people that I showed the work to. And I mean, I quickly realized that the application that I had sent in the first year wasn't good enough. I mean, I still needed to work on writing. And I can honestly say that without those 3 years of having a workshop outside of school, of really working on different stories, that I would have never gotten in, right? Even though, I mean, you know, I felt that first year that I applied that I had an interesting sort of point of view, something, and I had sort of a passion in me that could translate into really good writing with some help. But I think the reality for most programs in the US is that you have to, for them to accept you, you have to already sort of have some chops, and those chops you can only get by writing and by sort of taking the time to do it.
Well, we're getting to kind of the end of the notification season, if you want to call it that, where people are starting to find out whether they got into programs or whether they didn't. And I'm sure someone's listening right now who applied to the Michener program and didn't get in. And I would encourage you, go out and buy a copy of Best American Short Stories at an independent bookstore, as Alejandro would say, and or go to Electric Lit, where it's been reprinted there as well. You can read it for free, and read The Hands of Dirty Children. That story is fantastic, and just the idea that, like, you took your time, you worked at it, you improved, and you became this writer who can write a story like that and get into Michener. It's just a matter of keep going, keep writing, believe in yourself, keep getting better, because it's a continuous process, right? Like
Exactly.
You never stop learning as a writer. So I'm curious then, what do you feel like you've learned about the application and selection process at Michener that might be helpful to applicants who are listening?
Yeah, sure. So the first thing I would say about that is that the most important part of the application, like 100%, is the writing sample. If the writing is good, then that's your ticket in. So definitely to focus on the writing sample the most. I know the process. There's a pool of readers that the Michener Center has that are sort of the first people that read the work. They're very, very smart readers, but they're not faculty. They're not decision makers. They're just basically reading the pieces and separating into maybe piles, no piles, and I really like this piles, basically. And I think for that, some of the stuff that we were talking about early or in our conversation is really important. And it's those first few pages need to really, really work very well. Because usually, like readers for a magazine, like readers for journals, those first few pages are going to be the things that tell the reader, this is worth my time. And, those readers I believe, have to read the story completely. They can't just stop. But those first few pages are really going to make a difference. I've also heard this question a lot, and I'm part of a few of those sort of MFA Facebook groups. They certainly helped me a lot when I was applying. There's a few of them in Facebook. But I hear this question posed a lot there about if I should submit 2 stories, if I should submit 1, if I should submit an excerpt of a novel. And I have a strong feeling that it's much better to apply with just 1 story than it is with more than 1. I mean, a lot of writers feel like if I present range, then the Michener will really like that I can write in these different registers. But it is my strong feeling that it's more important for the Michener for writers to have a really strong point of view and to have something that maybe differentiates them from other writers. I mean, the student population in the program is extremely diverse. I think the Michener is interested in populating the program with people that are bringing sort of different experiences into the mix. So if you as a writer have a strong point of view about something, about anything that's really your passion and it's what really drives your writing, I think submitting something that has that in it is very important. It's certainly gonna tell the faculty if you get to that stage, this is a piece that will help other writers in the program sort of discover something new about their own writing. Because I know that the best part of the program for me has been reading the work of the other fiction writers in my cohort. I mean, everyone's coming at it from a different set of experiences, from a different point of view. So if you have that, I mean, certainly lead with it. And one great story that sort of shows that, I think, is going to be better than one story that kind of shows that and another one that is completely different because you wanted to kind of show that you could do more than one thing.
And then also you're writing fiction in this program in your second language, your first language being Spanish. So I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit as well, and how it's been to write in your second language and how supportive the program has been to you as a writer in a second language.
Yeah. Well, the truth of the matter is that I started writing when I was living here, and I had been living here for a little while. And I think I wanted to tell these stories in English because I think that these are the stories of Venezuela are very interesting and very rich, and I want people to know about my country and English as a written language has so much reach. So it felt good to me to step into that world and try to do my best to tell these stories and kind of translate some of the aspects of my culture and try my best at that. So that felt important to me. That felt like a motivation. It felt like it drove me and it drove my passion for writing. So that's why I do it. I also write some stuff in Spanish, but I'm so focused on the program right now and on these pieces that I'm not doing it that much right now, but it's something that I would love to certainly do more of in the future. I mean, the program has been 100% supportive with everything. I mean, they tell you this the second you arrive, right? That everyone there is at the service of the work that the people are doing in the program. And I felt that completely. I mean, the faculty, the staff, the resources that they give the students, it's all towards the goal of helping the writer realize their projects, whatever they are passionate about. And they're just stewards and shepherds of that kind of philosophy. They really leave you pretty much alone if you want to. And they are as hands-off or as hands-on as each student needs. And they're always available and always ready. I mean, the program, I think, has the reputation it has because they are that way, because they really follow through on that kind of ethos of you're here to have time to make great work, and we're going to try our best for you to do that.
Well, another unique part of the program is the interdisciplinary focus. While writers apply and are admitted in a primary genre, either fiction, poetry, playwriting, or screenwriting, they also study a secondary genre. Your secondary focus is screenwriting. What made you go in that direction?
I'm a really bad poet. No, I mean, I love movies. I love movies so much. Before the pandemic, I was in a theater 2 or 3 times a week. I really, really, really love it. And I've always wanted, I mean, when I was a kid, I wasn't necessarily a huge reader. Like I wasn't one of those kids that like is reading Virginia Woolf at 12 years old in a reading nook in a house or something. And like, I read tons of comic books. I watched tons of movies. That was sort of like my thing. And certainly movies was one of my first loves. So it was pretty obvious to me that if I had the chance to learn how to write movies, that I would jump at it. So it was really easy for me to make that decision. And it really excited me. Like that's one of the things that excited me so much about the Michener is that you were not allowed, you were required to do it.
So how has learning about screenwriting helped you think about fiction or vice versa?
That process is still happening. I think structure is certainly the big thing that screenwriting is sort of hammering into my head. I mean, most movies sort of follow a 3-act structure. The parameters of writing writing a modern screenplay are fairly rigid. They follow patterns of like the way that stories move people and why they move them. You know, you have a character that's in an old world. They make some sort of decision that propels them into a new world full of obstacles, full of uncertainties. They battle certain obstacles throughout. And then at some point, there's a climax, and then there's a resolution. Like that sort of like arc exists because it has an effect on people. It moves people. And that the shape of that story, certainly I feel is informing some of my writing, and is certainly bringing up things like, oh, you know, this character hasn't really taken a decision yet. Like the world is affecting him, but he's not really like pushing back against it. He's not making choices. In a movie, I mean, there's obviously also all sort of movies, and some people would say, you know, Alejandro, the 3-arc structure is garbage, whatever. But, I happen to believe that some of these things really are important and should resonate in fiction. And, you have a character make a choice, and that choice has consequences. And at some point, there's a conflict. All that stuff is hammered into screenwriting, and most movies that get produced have structures that sort of have those elements in them. And I think that some of the fiction that excites me also has those elements. Like, I like to write stuff that has like a strong plot. I like to read books that propel and that move, and where people are doing stuff. I like that, and certainly learning about screenwriting helps that.
So how often are you taking a course in screenwriting or your secondary genre? Maybe you could just talk about like what's a general semester in your program look like?
Sure. Every semester we have to take 3 classes. There's no teaching load in the Michener. There is a teaching load in the New Writers Project, which is the sister program. And by the way, I do want to take a minute just to talk about the New Writers Project, because it is such an amazing program in its own right. We take the same classes that the New Writer Project people do. We are in the same cohort, in the same classroom, with the same faculty. The support is really kind of very similar. There are some minor differences in stipend, but the New Writers Project is still very generous with it's a fully funded program as well. Students get a stipend. They do have a teaching component. And I believe, and I might be wrong with this, that the New Writers Project is now also a 3-year program. It used to be 2 years. So even in terms of time, those 2 programs are sort of very close. And I would certainly tell everyone that is applying to the Michener to also apply to New Writers Project, because it's a beautiful program and very supportive to its students. So before I did that aside,
you said that usually 3 classes per semester.
Oh yeah, usually 3 classes per semester. During the 3 years, you have to take 3 workshops on your primary field of study. So in my case, 3 fiction workshops. You have to take 2 workshops on your secondary field of study. So in my case, I would need to take 2 workshops in screenwriting through the 3 years. Then you have to take a few studies courses in your primary. I think it's 2 study courses on fiction and 1 on screenwriting. And then you have, I think, about 7 or 8 electives that you can choose. And basically you can choose whatever you want in the whole system of classes at UT that have to be at the graduate level or upper division. And then you have a couple of thesis classes. So the last 2 semesters that you have, one of your classes has to be on your thesis. So basically you meet with your instructor throughout the semester to talk about your manuscript. And then on the first year, you have a first year seminar that everybody has to take, that, mixes all the fiction, all the poets, all the screenwriters, all the playwrights together that have been admitted that year. And you get to really sort of get to know everyone, and also work in other disciplines and try your hands at everything. But the program is super flexible with that. I've had friends that are fiction primaries that are in my fiction cohort that have taken poetry workshops, playwriting workshops, and screenwriting workshops. And I have friends that have changed their secondary focus in the middle of the program, said, I thought I wanted to do screenwriting, but what I'm really passionate about right now is language. So, I have this great poet that's coming to school, so I'm just going to switch to poetry. And that's perfectly fine. I think the program understands that that's part of the dynamic, and they're facilitating all those decisions. They're helping you through them, and it's not this rigid system that kind of ties you down to one particular thing.
Well, it sounds great. And before we go, I want to give you the last word. If we missed anything that you really wanted to talk about, or if you have advice or anything that like maybe you know now that you wish you knew before that you want to share with listeners.
Well, I mean, just gathering the strength to apply to these programs, not being disillusioned if you get turned down. I mean, certainly for me, those rejections help me sort of work harder on my stuff. And it's the same, I think, with submitting work. I think we're all, as writers, very protective of our work, and we can all feel vulnerable when rejections come our way. But I think that's just part of writing, and kind of sticking to it makes such a huge difference. So I know some of these programs are extremely competitive, but working on craft and not forgetting that, like, what we're all really trying to do is get better at writing. And these programs obviously help a lot with that. But, it's all about working and working and working and working at it. And, eventually something gives, hopefully.
Well, congratulations on the recent success in publishing. And thank you so much for taking a few minutes to stop by and chat with me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Jared. It was a pleasure.